Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/capsulate today to request a demo. Are you looking for a solution to protect your web apps against the most business-critical security vulnerabilities? Unleash the power of automated ethical hacker knowledge with Detectify for continuous coverage and relevant security vulnerability findings. Upgrade your web app security with speed and scale and start a 2-week free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself. When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2021 All Access Pass. RSA Conference will be a virtual but fully operational experience from May 17th to 20th. Security Weekly, including us, will be live streaming Monday through Thursday on the virtual broadcast alley, interviewing some of the top sponsors and speakers for the event. To register with our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC 2021 and use the code 5U1Cyber. We hope to see you there. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. To subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, join our nice and active Discord server right now, and follow us on our newest live streaming platform, Twitch. Hello, subs. And that, John, brings us to the news of the week. Well, before we go on to what's happened in new Vulns and new fun research, let's do a quick follow-up on the Linux kernel deception Vulns and University of Minnesota. So I think that, or I know that you've read a little bit more details about what the emails that were going back and forth about this whole situation, and University of Minnesota released a response and apology for that matter to this. Before we go into what their apology looked like, I just want to throw it over to you, just some additional thoughts and background here if you want to dive in on this.
How about, wow, they really screwed up. No, well, obviously, yes, but yeah, man, we were talking off air about this. I dug through a lot of the kernel mailing lists, the threads on this after the show last week. And yeah, in all sorts of directions. I mean, there's a few guys that were looking at, okay, let's find all commit SHAs from the university for the last 6 months, a year, and just go ahead and remove those from the Linux kernel source because we don't know what's real, what's not. The developers weren't being clear about where they did their stuff. That you're caught. Just come on, stop with the games. And then there was there was at least one post in there where Greg KH called them out straight out, said look, we know you're doing this, you've done it before, and they're like, no, this was just a patch we were just submitting to try and be nice. And it's like, you've lost all, unfortunately, respect and trust. And it's and then we have this article which you posted, Mike, where it's when something. It's one thing if it's a single commit, but when it's been going on for a while and it's not clear how long it's been going on, and no one's really being super forthcoming with the details in a pretty quick manner, because this has been going on for 2 weeks now, I think. It's really an unfortunate situation. And then you think about things like where do those guys going to work after they graduate, if they graduate? Is the university going to have less people going there for CS? It's a really big deal. So I hope they clean it up quickly and be very transparent about it.
Yeah, there's definitely some reputational impacts that we've seen on the research side. And the two things that stood out to me, what I liked about their acknowledgement, the university's apology, was that one, they called out that they didn't really engage the kernel community to help set up a good protocol for doing this. Now, obviously, it's a deception study, but you can go about you could have a trusted cohort or some ways of setting this up so that it wouldn't be a complete surprise, nor such a difficult cleanup afterwards, saying that here are the explicit SHA commits that were intended to be introduced some vulnerabilities, and these are the ones that are completely unrelated to us. So a lot of just weak design there. And I think too, the other reason they're pulling this out is that even though that the security community, I don't think is going to be surprised. I, for one, wasn't too surprised that someone could attempt to introduce some vulnerabilities intentionally into source code. One of the things, though, is that I liked about the pushback and liked about the results here is that don't want this type of research to become a model for a lot of now security conference presentations, or just people kind of beating the dead horse, if you will, recreating this type of effort that ultimately just became a waste of time on the kernel maintainer side of things, without necessarily, or I think without at all, showing something that was a new threat model or introducing something that could lead to some meaningful changes in process or changes in the way that we're looking at these types of scale of code commits. And this is where my mind goes to things like just having better default compiler settings, as we were just talking about with Ray. How can your tools help you? The LLVM's address sanitizer, undefined behavior sanitizer, those are great starts. Additional fuzzing can be great starts. And just figuring out what are better ways we can have automation that are helping us to do that trust but verify, if you will, from committers who are sending in patches in good faith. So I thought it was some good follow-ups there. Oh, go ahead.
There's definitely, it's not just the tooling side of things, right? That's definitely going to help and capture a lot of this type of stuff. But I meant to just message you privately and I didn't. But I sent a pull request. We screwed up something on one of our releases. Actually, I screwed up something. Our build broke, but we'd already tagged the release, so the release got released on GitHub. One of the upstream package providers, I won't name names for now, but they went ahead and took that, and then I sent them a pull request to give them the correct SHA in their checksums. And as far as I know, they took my pull request without verifying who I was. So what I'm saying is that level of social engineering, or trust and verify, that there's still something to be done around that. But research, study, help, but it has to be done in an ethical manner.
It does. And that's a great point, because it's the idea of, that comes back to identity for sure, in the sense of signed commits, who has authority to make these types of changes. Because you could also have, go back to the idea of HSTS or PKP, public key pinning within browsers. It would be pretty wonderful denial of service against a website if you were able to convince a browser vendor to pin a certificate to a certificate, an intermediate cert that an app isn't using at all. So obviously we haven't seen that happen, and there are some good safeguards in place to do so. But I think it mostly relies on webs of trust, in the sense of who can vouch for who within this ecosystem, which doesn't necessarily say who has the authority to say, oh, use this SHA versus this other SHA. So that's a great example, and I just jogged my memory about other ways that could come up within this type of committing code ecosystem.
Yeah, and to be really clear on that, they might have done a little bit of background on me and figure out who I was, but as far as I know, they just took it. So.
Well, hopefully they've been hanging out in a Discord channel and paying attention to ASW, and they know the expertise that comes from Mr. John Kinsella. John, we'd also love some of your expertise as we talk about some of the more recent news of this week. One that was pretty cool to me was BadAlloc. So this is from Microsoft, and they're pretty much showing that here are some examples of very well-known BadAlloc, basically memory-based C functions that have gone haywire or just basically off by one. Heap overflows, underflows, overflows, really simple things. But what they found were a lot of vulnerabilities within some real-time operating systems and in some SDKs that are used within not so much IoT like retail IoT, but in industrial control systems, in operational technology, which is more of an umbrella for that combination of here is a big device, a big engine that has some embedded code running in it that's part of a manufacturing process or something, pretty consequential like that. And it just so happens to have a pretty vanilla, basic memory misuse, memory allocation vulnerability. So a little bit disappointing that these types of vulns still are around, but pretty cool to see this research, pretty cool to see the research shared. And actually, one of my questions here would be an outstanding question for the Microsoft team is, what was their methodology for finding this? Did they actually have some fuzzers and some tooling helping them with this in their Area 52, or sorry, their what they call themselves, Region 52 research
Section
group?
52, yeah.
Section 52, thank you. Or was this pure, once again, just manual inspection and code review poking around at some suspicious areas?
I'd presume it has to be some level of automation, but and what was interesting, what this made me think of, back to thinking of talking about Discord again. So some of our listeners actually talk on Discord when we're not live on the air, and something I'm trying to get into more myself. But someone mentioned on there, last week, it was actually a conversation or a blog post around SBOM and the idea of SBOM and OT. And the idea is, should a vendor be publishing their SBOM so even if they don't patch something, people at least know that that's in that product? And that they're sort of slightly hinting at that here too. I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest. As a vendor, I don't know if I'd want to publish my SBOM. I need to think about that more. We obviously do it on open source, but it's interesting to see them on this. And I think we're going to talk. I'll bring up Microsoft again later in one of our other articles, but I think it was related to something else as well. But yeah, interesting.
Interesting, and it's interesting too to talk about that SBOM, because SBOM clearly is of importance to the IoT world, especially on the retail side, but I think possibly more importantly too from this industrial side as well, just about what is built and how fragile might something be. And I understand a little bit what's getting at in the sense of, do we want to publish an SBOM for all of us to see what version we're on, especially if that version has known vulnerabilities? I tend to fall on the side that doesn't really matter, because just publishing the SBOM doesn't make it any more difficult or any easier for an attacker to simply scan and try to deliver that vulnerability anyway, through like a spray and pray sort of attack, so to speak. But that can be kind of loud. But it also, to me, just seems that it's more just opening up the aspect of, here's what we have, and how quickly can we patch? Because even if we were quiet on the SBOM, patches can come out. We've seen a lot of historical evidence that researchers or attackers are reverse engineering binary patches to figure out what the vulnerability was in the first place, be able to go poke around at that, and even find alternate executions, variants is what the word I'm looking for, on these vulnerabilities. So some cool stuff to think of. It's great thing to bring up, talking about SBOM and how what are some implications around that might be around that from a security perspective. So we'll definitely have to come back to think about that some more. And please send us, listeners, send us some more information around there, some other blog posts or tooling around that, because I think there's some more we could talk about.
And I'll inject really quickly. I think the other Microsoft thing I was thinking about might have actually been related to this, which was, there was something which came out last week which they found when they were doing R&D on their Sphere stuff. So this sounds close enough that I suspect they're the same thing. So that's how they found it. They're probably fuzzing for that now.
Yeah, probably. You find one instance of a bug in one spot in your own code, for example, and you're like, cool. We at least have a capability to find this in one place. Why don't we go poke around and see if there's 25 other places where this similar type of bug exists. And I will say, now obviously this was a Microsoft research, and they did say that the Microsoft Azure RTOS thread X is not vulnerable to a lot of what they were highlighting here. It's not vulnerable in its default configuration. So I will say, perhaps this is a little bit of Microsoft, doing a bit of subtle or not too subtle marketing on their own operating system there. But I will say, to me at least, it's nice to see that a default configuration wasn't vulnerable. And I think setting aside a little bit of we're happy we weren't as bad off here, but more so of what can we do just better about defaults? Because especially within ICS, OT, defaults are probably what's going to be most prevalent, and why not start with the more secure baseline rather than saying, here's our RTOS and here's our 20-page checklist in order to deploy it securely. Let's drop that down into a 1 or 2 point checklist and have those defaults just start off in a much better situation. But we've possibly destroyed that article quite a bit. Let's shift from Windows, or from Microsoft, over to macOS. Here was a pretty cool vulnerability in the macOS Gatekeeper. Now, I want to preface this with the idea that let's make sure that we keep some threat modeling in perspective here. So this isn't a remote execution type of the world is falling because of macOS Gatekeeper bypass, but it is pretty cool that this is a part of, call it user-assisted malware, or essentially a phishing campaign, or something that would have some pretext to say, oh, John, by the way, please double-click what you've just downloaded here. Now, normally what Gatekeeper is designed to do is pop up an alert that says, you double-clicked on this. Are you sure you want to execute this item that you just downloaded from the web? And in other cases, actually, it's actually going to block you from executing that at all, just because of the way that macOS has quarantined certain applications when they're downloaded. And the 2 articles that I linked to here have some really good technical details on this that are pretty gnarly to get into. But what was really neat to me is that as much as we talk about shifting to Rust, shifting to Go, shifting to a lot of other languages, I'm still going to stand on my soapbox that we're going to be dealing with logic and implementation types of errors. And this is a great example of an implementation error in logic that's sort of an oops, here is a script-based application that just so happens to be missing an info.plist file that normally would classify this as a bundle, which Gatekeeper would say, oops, I need to make sure I have some quarantine, some alerts that fire when you do this. But if that one file is missing, then you can bypass all of that and it's just going to execute. So pretty cool, pretty great write-ups from Patrick Wardle, someone who's pretty well known in the macOS reverse engineering community. So if you want to read some more about reverse engineering, check out those articles. Great technical write-ups. And I might have exhausted all there's there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it was pretty amazing that this existed out there in the wild for so long without someone realizing it. I mean, this is...
Yes.
It's sort of shocking, but keep going. You've said enough.
Well, you gave me some time to think of a good segue, but I still failed on a good segue. So I'm just going to say now we're going to talk about 2 authentication-related issues. Now, these are 2 articles that mostly related to Kerberos, so a KDC spoofing and an Active Directory flaws. And now this is a little bit of a callback to some conversations we had about authentication vulnerabilities that we saw in SAML and OpenID and OAuth, etc. The reason I brought these in again is that these 2 articles have, once again, pretty nice write-up. They're demonstrating some ways that vulnerabilities are actively exploited by attackers. So that's also can be helpful to inform. And the articles themselves just give a good background on what is Kerberos. So you can learn some basics of the protocol, just understanding some fundamentals of how do we authenticate and authorize activities between services. Also, just as an aside, has the article from Silverfort had a nice call out to the history of KDC, Kerberos spoofing in this area, all the way back to some work from Doug Song back in 2000. So it's just nice to see that there's some context here that these aren't necessarily new vulns. So with that bit of preamble aside, I brought these out as more of an aspect of how would you take the principles here, the concepts here, in terms of spoofing responses back to the KDC that says, oh yeah, I do have a token, or I've obtained the certificate that's used to sign trust relationships, and I'm using that throughout my cloud deployment. So these are still concepts that I think can be pretty applicable to AWS, to GCP, in the sense of how are you protecting your tokens? How are you enforcing least privileges within your IAM setup? So I think there's some ways to take these as sort of a pre-mortem, if you will, or just a way to set up some conversations about threat modeling with your developers and the complexity within cloud deployments. So that's the angle I wanted to bring out here. Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is, yeah, exactly. That was the pause I tried to throw to John. Try not to catch you off guard.
Oh no. I'm paying attention. And you know, as you mentioned about the machine and the Amazon-ish bits, yeah, we covered Curb was one of the options we covered in that 5 ways a few weeks ago to authenticate cloud to cloud. Two things on this well, one on just both. I can't believe people are still managing to find issues with Curb. It's impressive, especially two at the same time. Makes me wonder again if this was, well, maybe we're coming up to RSA, so the press is getting ready, PR is getting ready. But then on the Silver Fort one, there's a section on there for developers, which I thought, you know, we're fans of that. Anytime you can sort of, you know, help the developers directly understand what the issue is and how to improve upon it. But in particular, their second point, use Wireshark. I in a smaller shop, sure, yeah, or you know, a very senior developer, I get that. But a lot of these orgs out there, I mean, maybe if they're talking about a protocol developer, then you'd be there. But the average developer, Wireshark, don't think so.
No, don't think so. And that's what's interesting, as I was trying to also to pull out some additional resources to help with this. And one of the things actually we haven't talked about, I don't think too much here on the series, is the OWASP cheat sheet series. And they do have a handful on authentication topics. There's one that's pretty good on access control, and there's another one about microservices security that talks about authentication, authorization issues. So I think those are pretty good, at least to look at. And if you just want a kind of a high-level introduction to some of the basics of threat modeling around session management, there is a session management cheat sheet, but those at least I'd nudge you towards before just installing Wireshark and looking at packets on the wire, unless of course you are a protocol developer. And I think that's what I think I've exhausted myself on that, because there's some other interesting things to talk about. One is in the spirit of threat modeling. Here's an example from Krebs on Security, talking about an Experian API that exposed credit scores of most Americans. And the flaw here came out of an API in one of their third parties, one of their partners, that was exposing their own data, the Experian's data. Now, there's a couple areas to open up here, but to me it was also very much that example of, sure, we have some security champions perhaps in our own developer crew. We have a lot of controls around our own APIs, around our data, but then our data leaves our premises. We have, goes to someone else's cloud, or our API is for another API developers to consume, or we've created an SDK, and suddenly that sphere of influence isn't quite as in depth as it could be. And this is now where you get not quite a supply chain flaws, but our third party supplier or suppliers to, I lost my train of thought there, but API security breaks down. So that was the angle I wanted to pull out of this particular article, and sort of talk about it from how are others consuming our API, for that matter, and have we done enough to be able to figure out when they either might be abusing it, or those third-party APIs that are one step removed from us are being abused.
Yeah, I think there's an area we're going to see. There's plenty of space for improvement for at least the next 18 months, is my guess. So we've been, API security, we've talked about a few times. It's been on our minds for a few years now. I get the sense that people aren't still fully. It's either they might be starting to think about more, but I don't think we're actually getting the purchase we need on it. We're aware of the browser stuff and all those type of things, but I still see so many orgs that are doing, my private API versus my public API. And it's like, dude, the guy who is running Wireshark, the malicious person, he doesn't care if it's public or private. He's still going to see it. And or if it's documented or not. I think that there's a lot of that type of thing going on, or as we move more towards this developer first shifting left, there's more consumption of third-party APIs by the developers. So yeah, I think we'll be talking about this one for a while, I think.
Yeah, we will. And I think, and that's you remind me another point I was going to make when we were talking about all the Kerberos stuff, is that in that particular threat model, you needed someone in a privileged network position, basically meaning that you needed somebody who could inspect traffic and be able to spoof packets. And here you're talking about, is it an internal private API or is it a public API? And the point that I'm slowly getting to here is in the idea of modern cloud environments, it's pretty simple. If you've compromised an instance, it can suddenly be pretty simple to now be in that privileged network position to either spoof traffic, or you don't even need to spoof traffic. You're on that service, and now you can actually interact with it just as perhaps another trusted service within that org. You're assuming you don't even need credentials. You're just injecting into a process, something like that. So I'm sort of my long-winded way of getting to that agreement in the sense of public versus private API, that line probably isn't blurred so much in the modern cloud environment, especially if you have especially depending on how much network segmentation you have within your service-to-service communication, and how that identity and authentication is working. There is one final thing. I'm going to save the Spectre for last. I'm going to switch over, and rather than talk about some Vulns for a bit, the article that I picked up from TLDR-Sec. So thanks once again, Clint, for a good newsletter. Always a good thing to find some interesting AppSec thoughts articles. This is just from Twilio that's talking about changing security tool requirements in the new DevSecOps world. So, it's a buzzword compliant article title, if you will. But the teasing aside, I like this article because it's a really quick read, but it really just points to that aspect of tools need to integrate into the IDEs, or tools need to be usable by developers. And this goes back to a point that you had made in the last segment, John, just about we can't spend all of our time just talking about, we're going to do more training, and then we're going to do some more training, and then we're going to have security champions. We do need some tooling somewhere, and those tools need to be helpful. And if those tools are in our IDEs, that's actually going to, and in the CI/CD workflow for that matter, that's probably going to be a lot better than just saying, go use a security tool because it fixes everything, and it's going to take up even more time to weed out the false positive, false negative, et cetera, versus, it's just part of your IDE, creates a little red squiggly line that says this code looks sus, and go from there. Yeah,
and that's. I want to make sure we're careful with that and we don't do the sort of machine learning rainbow type thing. Yes. It's a lot easier said than done, right? It's not the same as I guess if I was to give an analogy, it's a lot closer to a grammar checker in a say Microsoft Word compared to a spell checker, and that those things still are. I won't say wrong, but not accurate a good chunk of time. So I think it's something I've like I said, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how do we make those, how do I get to that guy's seat and make something that what he wants to use and fits into his life cycle without, doing the hi, I'm from security and I'm here to help, that type of thing. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about. I think I've said a few times on here now recently, last few weeks, I think a lot of people have products out there saying they're shifting left, but how do you actually really shift left? How do you actually really get into that side of things? And what does that really look like in a successful way for that development team? So yeah, it's almost too short. It's sort of, by the time you realize what's going on, you've read it. But still it's a decent think piece.
Yeah, that's why I really wish to pull out some more heft from there, because especially coming from developers, I think to your point as well, seeing how they actually use these tools rather than telling them how they should be using those tools is a very subtle product management perspective to take. And I think you can be more successful when you're talking to developers and they say, yep, this is how I'm using this, and this is how it looks like in my daily basis, and this is what helps me, rather than, oh, I just need to use this tool because somebody said so. Speaking of tools and somebody said so, that's not related to the final article on, or at least one of them that I had about some more research that's coming out of Spectre. So this is looking at micro-op caches, and this plus the initial Microsoft work on BadAlloc reminded me that we hadn't talked about some cool aerospace engineering or some aerospace flaws. So John, I'm going to throw that over to you just as some future to go find us some cooler Vulns and those cool industrial systems. So let's have that.
I'm actually. Oh, go ahead. I keep my eye out. I'm still an active subscriber to ours' Rocket Report. I'm not seeing anything good come through, but I'm looking.
Excellent. So, listeners, help us out. Make sure we find some cool stuff for John to talk about. But in this case, we're talking about, again, going into Intel AMD processors, and this isn't a sky is falling type of article. Just so that's one of the themes of the flaws that we've been talking about within this particular episode. But it is interesting, just in the spirit that just a few weeks ago we were talking from Google researchers were demonstrating Spectre proof of concept attacks within modern browsers and showing how JavaScript could be used to exploit them. And so there now has been a lot of work from developers from kernel developers, especially low-level systems engineers, figuring out how can we make sure we have high-performing chips that aren't leaking a lot of information that can be used to pull out secrets from these trusted processes. Now, of course, you need to be executing code on a system. I think even in this case, you have to actually be executing within the shared threads of the target process. So there's a lot of things that are necessary to pull off this type of attack. But I mentioned that in the sense of just saying sky is not falling, but also I do want to acknowledge that this is some pretty cool reading. And if you're interested in Spectre, interested in side channels, there's a lot of clever places to be able to look and say, here's a way of inferring what's going on within a CPU. So some CPU gearheads out there would love to read about it, dive in to this article, but I think that's going to exhaust the level of detail that I'm going to be able to comfortably explain for our listeners.
These ones always seem to come out on Friday afternoons, and this one hit me on a Friday afternoon, and
yes.
So yeah, that's how I wrapped up last week. You know, and I'm happy we are actually ending on this article because this comes right back to where we started with Ray talking about all these things we have in modern technology, which security was never thought of when they were designed. When the Intel guys were first doing speculative execution, and the cache. CC Newman, all those type of things in the early 2000s. I don't think security was, we thought about security when we think about Ring 0, Ring 1, when those first came out, the 486, 386, and how do we break through that ring? But I don't, and maybe they were, I could be completely wrong, but I don't think it was being actively thought about, this whole concept of what could you do with speculative execution? These aren't easy ones to fix. Even if it is an easy software fix, hell, even if it's an easy microcode fix, that's still not something you're going to roll out very quickly across the world. So yeah, it's an interesting read to really, I suspect a lot of folks don't fully understand how speculative execution works. So it's a nice little bit of light reading there for folks who want to get down to the microcode level of stuff.
No, good point. And I think, too, for everyone with their own desktop, laptop, you're going to be far more worried about the type of attack we talked about in the macOS Gatekeeper bypass and that type of here's some malware to download and execute than you ever will be about having to worry about this type of Spectre microcode type of attack. The people who are worrying about this are probably the Amazons, Googles, Microsofts, who are dealing with a fleet of cloud servers who want to make sure that those guarantees about tenant isolation, VM isolation, that those security boundaries have remained in place, and that they're doing things smartly about process isolation or process-to-process communication using RPCs, so that these types of speculative attacks can't get into any of the address space and pull out secrets from the peers. And of course, just where they are, how they are assigning threads on a particular CPU cores. So a lot of interesting things there. And we're going to say, I guess I'll say one final comment. Listeners, please do throw us not only some cool industrial and high-end aerospace flaws, but if you got some more chip-related things, send them over to John on a Friday afternoon so we can make sure he keeps his weekends occupied. But with that call out, yeah, you're welcome, John. Glad to have you here, and glad to have everyone here listening to us. Want to say one more thanks out to Ray for joining us in the previous segment. We're going to, I guess this is how I wrap up. We're going to see you next week on Application Security Weekly.